Welcome to the method! In today's episode, we talk with Stephanie Hearne. She works for the police force. Her role mainly includes investigating cases that involve things like child abuse, domestic violence, and other situations that involve vulnerable people. In today's conversation, we find out how she carries out that role effectively.
The method, we're eating or sleeping or fight. The method, for a marriage or divorce or one night. Well, I know you probably think that it sounds pretty dumb, but the methods you use to get shit done. If you're chatting up a lover, you're going on a run, then it might be wise to heed the words of a pro with a little bit of help. Who knows, to get some happiness out of your woes, to get promoted to CEO of a happy mind inside your head. You don't want to wake up dead, thinking why do you work so hard on things that hardly work for you. The method works.
So, hello everybody. Today we are joined by none other than my own sister, Stephanie Hearne. And Steph, why don't you tell us what you do? Because I don't know your exact job title. It's always changing.
Okay, I'm a police officer. The role that I have at the moment is I'm a detective sergeant in a safeguarding team. So my team deal with crimes against vulnerable adults, domestic abuse, and child protection.
Right. So it's pretty intense.
Yeah.
You didn't really come into this in the normal route.
No, I wasn't one of those children that dreamt of being a police officer. Not at all, really. Although Mum will tell you that I wanted to be Polly from the Bill when I was little. I wanted to be a solicitor. That was my aim. I decided that that's what I wanted to do when I was about 13. I went through university, I went to law school, I did my exams. I was applying for a training place to be a solicitor, and I needed a short-term job while I was applying, and I applied for a job in the police as a PA initially. And within 2 days of being in the police station, I didn't want to leave. Absolutely loved it. Sounds so cheesy, but it fell in my lap, and it was exactly what I always wanted to do.
What was it about being in the police station itself? Because I imagine at that point you weren't really doing nearly the job you're doing now.
No. At that point, I was very much doing an admin job, but I was doing an admin job for very senior officers. So I was very lucky to get an insight into things like senior meetings, how different parts of the force fitted together, high level operations, things like that. So it was a very privileged job, considering it was an entry level admin job at the same time. But the thing that really got me was, I think that personally, having had no experience with the police beforehand, I and a lot of people I know had really underestimated what the police actually do. I wanted to work for the Crown Prosecution Service, and the reason I wanted to work for them is because I wanted to work in criminal law and I wanted to build prosecution cases. And when I got into the police station and I saw what the detectives do and what the officers do, I very much saw that they are building cases. It's not the CPS that are building them from the ground up. It's very much the police, and they do, not only do they gather the evidence, they have to evaluate things, they set lines of inquiry, they look at where, the positives and negatives, can we take this to court? And there's a huge process that goes on before the CPS are even approached. And I think that was what sold it to me. It was like, I kind of knew what I wanted to do day to day, but the bit I got wrong was who did that.
So that kind of idealized Hollywood version of the lawyer, / private detective going out and collecting the information, is, you're saying, is what you thought you were going to be.
Yeah, I thought Crown Prosecution Service would be getting in the evidence, they'd be building the case, they'd be looking at, what we're going to take to court. And actually, that's not the Crown Prosecution Service, that's the police officers. And I mean, being a barrister obviously is a different story. You're in court, you're presenting that case, but the solicitors who work for the CPS never see the inside of a courtroom, really. Whereas I get to do everything in my job, well, not so much as a sergeant, but before, when I was a detective constable, you do everything from interviewing the victim, interviewing the suspect, up to sitting in the courtroom and giving evidence.
Essentially, everything you do could end up in court.
Yes.
Like, so when does that put you on edge?
I think it's something you get used to. I think it's something that adds pressure, but at the same time, things like victim interviews, I mean, we are not legal experts trained to the level of the CPS. So we probably do ask things that maybe then later aren't admissible in court, but they can be edited down. You know, we do interviews with victims, and the defence and the prosecution will talk about those interviews in the courtroom and decide which bits they want cut out and which bits they don't think are admissible. So it's kind of almost like, well, gather as much as you can, and if it's a case of they won't admit it, then they don't.
What did your sort of journey look like going from entry level up to where you are now? I'm sure there were probably quite a few different roles within that space of time. And did you have particular roles as you were working your way up that you enjoyed more than others?
Definitely. I did my application and actually got in very, very quickly. So I was very lucky that they were kind of at the end of the waiting lists, because there's officers that I know that waited up to 2 years to get into the police. I wasn't in that situation. I was very much applied at a time when there weren't too many pending applications. So I had to do there's a course that you had to do before you start. So sort of quite a fairly basic law course. Did that, put my application in, and I actually got a phone call and said, can you join in 5 days' time? And luckily, because I was obviously already working for the police, I went to my boss and said, look, this is the offer I've had. And he was good enough to release me really quickly. And the turnaround was really, really fast. And I was in training school the next Monday morning. So when you join the police, so when I joined, it's changed slightly now, I think. I think there's a few different routes now, but it was 10 weeks in training school, 10 weeks out on response, where I was working one-on-one with another officer before they kind of sign you off. And then since then I've worked in response roles, so responding to 999 calls. I've worked in CID, who deal with more general crimes. So they deal with frauds, they deal with GBHs, they deal with higher level drugs things, stuff like that. And then I went to do a 1.5 years in the sexual offences team, who are a specialist team who cover the whole county. And they just deal with basically Section 1 and Section 2 sexual offences, so rape offences and penetration offences. And they just deal with adults. So I did that for about 1.5 years before I actually requested to come back to safeguarding, because it's somewhere that I'd worked before. And within about four months of being back in safeguarding, I applied for my temporary promotion, which is what I'm doing now.
All right. So did you get to choose which role you moved up into, or was it something that you kind of got placed in?
So the first year is lots of attachments that you have to do. After that, it was kind of on response team, and that's where everybody starts. So that's kind of everybody's starting block, I guess. Some people love it and it's where they stay. And then some people kind of use that as somewhere to gain the experience that they need to move on. So that they were ones that I had to do. I'm definitely not a natural response officer. I can do it, and I think it's really important that all officers are able to do that. But for me, I'm much more of I want to sit down, I want to evaluate things, whereas that fast-paced, making decisions in the moment, things that it's a hell of a lot of pressure, because if you don't ask the right question or don't do the right thing or don't seize the right thing there and then, sometimes it's like you can't come back from that. You can't go back and fix that. So that kind of fast-paced environment wasn't really ever for me. I chose to go into investigations. So there's kind of a split in the police. So you have what they call operations, which is very much kind of all the frontline stuff. And then you have investigations, which is more of the CID, safeguarding, the people who are more office-based the majority of the time. I requested to go into investigations. They opened up a scheme for PCs who were interested in becoming detectives to move into investigations. So I applied for that. And initially I went into CID. But safeguarding was always my goal. It was always something that I wanted to work in. It's something that really affects people's real lives. And domestic abuse has always been something that I've done, sounds odd to say done well in, but it's something I think that I'm a fairly sympathetic person. And I also think that it's something that interests me. So that's something that I'm always going to excel in. And as a law student, I did a voluntary placement for about a year at the National Centre for Domestic Violence, which used to be a charity that basically assisted victims in getting civil orders to prevent their abusers from coming back to the house or from coming near to them, a bit like restraining orders. So it was something that I already had experience in, so it was something that I knew I wanted to work towards. So that was something that I asked for, to move from CID to safeguarding. But our safeguarding then put me onto my detectives training course. So once you've done your detectives training course, you have to do 6 months in a public protection place. So I did mine in the safeguarding department, but I know other people sometimes did theirs in sexual offences or other places. And then you had to do 6 months in CID. So I did those two, but I was always naturally much more of a safeguarding officer than I was a CID officer. So yeah, but not a lot of places are just given to you. Sexual offences was a posting. It was something that I was just told you go to. And as a police officer, you sign up that you can be sent with 28 days notice to any post across Surrey. I personally have found that the police are very good at looking at where you live, what you want to do, and trying to put people in the right places. But ultimately, if staff are needed, staff are needed. And yeah, sexual offences was a posting for me. I was lucky because it was something that I actually really enjoyed. Yeah. But it wasn't something that I chose to do initially.
I'm interested to know how your view of the world has changed since going into the police, because you work in quite a dark part of the police in a lot of ways, but like you're constantly seeing the worst side of people, and then you go into the real world and you have to sort of tell yourself, well, I'm constantly seeing the bad side of people, and actually in the real world there's a lot more good stuff going on. So how do you kind of compartmentalize the bad stuff that you see at work and then just see, a plethora of people in everyday life and be like, well, most of these people are actually good people?
I mean, I think it is difficult because it does open your eyes, especially in the department that I work in, because 99% of what I deal with goes on behind closed doors. You would never know that it was going on when you're just living your life, I suppose. So it does open your eyes to that massively. I suppose for me, it's surrounding myself with good people. I mean, I've got lovely friends and family. I know that the majority of people out there are nice, empathetic, generous individuals. I think also there's the way I probably balance the trauma in my head is, yes, you're hearing all of these awful things, but you're also working to stop those things from happening again. And it does probably make you more kind of acutely aware. But I think at the same time, you just have to look at the people that you socialise with and the people that are around you. And and you realise that actually there's a lot of really great people in the world. There's just these small group of bad people, and you're doing a job that is hopefully going to make that group smaller.
Yeah. Are you often surprised by the characters who are committing the abuse?
Yes and no. I think that you learn the warning signs and you learn the flags, and you interview lots of different suspects. You learn when people are lying, things like that. There are always surprises. I think that everybody who works in my job has probably been in an interview and 100% believed what they've said and thought, oh, this is either made up or it's a misunderstanding. And then you get a piece of evidence come across your desk that says, no, 100% they did do it. And I think as an officer, you get quite shocked because you kind of think that you can't really be fooled. So there are those people out there. But in general, I think sometimes it can be quite sad, the people that, particularly in child abuse, the people that are in potentially positions of trust or, and not necessarily official positions of trust like teachers, but, people who are doing things to either their own children or a partner's children, things like that.
Yeah.
It does make you sad that somebody's in that position and they're choosing somebody so vulnerable as a victim, somebody with no choice. But at the same time, it's one of those things that you just remember that is a small minority.
Well, yeah, it wasn't even that long ago, was it, that intermarital rape was even illegal? Was it?
No, it certainly was in my lifetime. It was around the early 90s that became illegal. So that's how late we're talking.
And the implication of that is that that sexual abuse by somebody that you know is not as severe as by somebody that you don't know, which is a complete fallacy, isn't it? Because someone you know is someone that you trust, like you're saying, like someone that you actually trust to know what things you don't like and how to like flip you and sort of like work in your head. And that's wow.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I think that, I don't think there's any better or worse crimes necessarily, because it's all about individual impact on that victim. But yeah, when you say about the mental abuse, there's a crime that came into play in about 2015, coercive and controlling behaviour, which is all about that mental abuse. So it's all about being so controlling of somebody and so kind of mentally damaging to somebody that they have to change their lifestyle to accommodate you, or there's a significant consequence to not observing those rules. And there's a reason that that's now illegal. And I've interviewed a lot of different victims of different things, and that is hugely impactful. That person that is in your house, in your life, in the place that is supposed to be safe. And I think that's the thing about domestic abuse, is it's the person that you should be safest from. And actually it's you don't have a safe place because they're in your home. They're in the place that should be your kind of sanctuary. So yeah, definitely. I think domestic abuse can be downplayed. It can be overlooked sometimes, but actually you're right. There is no easier or worse offence necessarily. It depends how it affects the individual, but certainly domestic abuse is something coming from that person that you should be able to trust more than anyone.
In your experience, and maybe in your opinion, what are the sort of most common causes of, like, what sends people to this place where they feel like they have to, perform domestic abuse, where they're sort of so maybe angry and violent and maybe severely depressed, addicted to alcohol and drugs? Like, what do you think sends people there?
That's a really difficult question. Certainly, there is an element of people who have either witnessed or been victim to physical abuse in their childhood. Ultimately, when you see your parents or your caregivers, they become your template for relationships. So if that's an abusive relationship, sometimes that happens. Drugs are a huge thing, huge thing, especially things like the paranoia. I mean, I think paranoia is where a lot of the psychological abuse comes from, because people get paranoid, they get jealous, and then their answer to that jealousy or that paranoia is to then control that other person so that they can't do anything, when actually obviously, to anybody with a healthy mindset, the answer is to build trust, where actually for a lot of people they just want to lock that person down so that there is no opportunity for cheating, there is no opportunity for anything else. But ultimately obviously it's never acceptable, it's never okay, but you do see drugs and abuse in childhood play a role.
Yeah. I'm interested in sort of how severe the cases are that you're dealing in, because I imagine loads of women are sexually abused on a very small scale, and whether that comes to you as a police officer or whether you're only dealing with the cases that are so severe that they can't even be hidden, and if there's some sort of move to try and gain more ground for guys that are just, continuing when they shouldn't and not getting the right level of consent.
I mean, any sexual offence that's reported will be investigated.
Okay.
So the level is which team that then goes to. Sometimes there's a grey area. So we have the sexual offences team, we have the safeguarding team, and we have the neighbourhood policing team. So all three of them will deal with certain elements of sexual offences and certain elements of domestic abuse. So domestic abuse, any domestic incident that a response officer goes to, because they're always the first ones to go, even if it's a really high level offence, they're always the first to attend. So they will sit down, they will talk to the victim, they will complete what we call a DASH risk assessment, which is essentially a list of questions that are indicators of potential future serious abuse, and to evaluate what they've been to. So they'll sit down, they'll go through that with the victim, and they will then give them a grading. So they're all qualified to give a grading to that. Standard risk, generally speaking, stays with the neighbourhood policing team, the response team. Medium and high risk come to my team, unless it's an offence of rape or penetration, and then it will go to the sexual offences team. So it kind of gets shared out like that, but they will all be investigated, and there are certain circumstances where if it sits better with a different team, it will be moved to another team, because ultimately we want the right outcome for the victim, and we want, to be able to prosecute an abuser if that's what they are. So that's how kind of it will get moved around, but ultimately it will all get investigated.
Yeah. But I think a lot of people are scared to bring it up, aren't they?
Yeah, and there is, I mean, I don't have the statistics in front of me, but I know that the majority of domestic abuse victims will go through a huge number of incidents before they report to police, a huge number. And that's what makes the police response so important, because that might be your only chance. And the chances are that somebody's been through a hell of a lot before they've come to you. So that might be your one shot to actually be able to get them to talk to you. And it's a real mental battle as well for victims, because ultimately, some of them will know that they're victims, but at the same time, they don't want to get that person in trouble, because they are torn between, this is the person who is causing them harm and this is the person that they love. And that's a torturous place to be.
I guess that adds to the whole. I guess for the victim, it adds to the experience of it, because it's not only a physical battle. It's also a very, very challenging psychological battle.
Absolutely.
Do you? I'm just thinking about things that have kind of been going on in the world, and maybe it's more of an American thing or something. But a lot of people say that the police don't get enough training. So do you think that, in your experience, the police do get enough training to be able to go into these situations and deal with them effectively?
I don't know if there's such thing as enough training. I think that there's always more that you can do. I would say that we have some really brilliant training. I know, certainly I can only speak for the police force that I work for, but we've had some brilliant external speakers come in. We've had some really great stuff. But I think, yes, training is brilliant and it's a great place to start, but you can never, ever train for every scenario. You can't. Every victim is different. Every victim responds differently to different people. If you then go, it's how you speak to somebody, it's your manner, it's the way they've kind of taken to you, it's the first impression, and you'll never ever face the same set of circumstances twice. So training is a brilliant place to start. Looking for signs of risk, red flags, stuff like that is great. But at the same time, a lot of it comes down to the personal skills and the ability to be flexible and reactive in the moment of the officer as to how those interactions go. Because ultimately, yes, training's great. Yes, we do role plays, we do various different things, but it's having that conversation, and it's that person-to-person moment, and being human, I think, is the biggest thing. You can't go in and say, right, well, this is how I've trained to be in a domestic, because you are sitting down and you are talking to that individual and getting the best evidence you can while also supporting that person. And I think that massively comes down to the officer.
Yeah, I think the thing that Alex is sort of talking about is the movement to defund the police in America, which there's been talks of it in England, but not as much, I don't think. But the idea being that you defund the police and then you replace maybe your sector with social workers, because they're kind of saying that the police aren't trained to talk to vulnerable people the same way a social worker would. At least that's how I've seen it explained. They sort of like rebuild the police as a different thing. And do you think that in your line of investigation that you get enough help knowing how to treat people like a social worker would, as well as having to know how to work as a detective as well?
Yeah, I mean, I can't comment on how much training social workers get. I work very closely with social workers in my role. I speak to social workers probably on a daily basis. I would say that we do different roles, but roles that overlap. So we certainly, if we think a child has been a victim of crime, we go out with a social worker. But ultimately, we have significant training in speaking to people who are vulnerable. There are national levels of accreditation to be able to interview vulnerable people, children. But we are social workers do a very different role. Sometimes from the outside, they look the same. When we go round and we speak to children and we speak to vulnerable adults, might look like we're asking the same questions, but we're asking for different reasons. And ultimately, social workers are responsible for the overall care of that person, making sure that the kind of ongoing, that person is safe. And yes, we do that as well, but ultimately we're looking for evidential points. We're looking for what we can then take to court to prevent that abuser from abusing anybody else. And that's the difference. And I don't think there's much in my job that you could replace with a social worker, because I think it takes both sides to ensure the safety of that person long term.
Do you ever wonder when you're in a room with somebody if you trying to find evidence could be at the detriment of their comfort? So maybe they're seeing you and they're looking for somebody to sort of play a role in making them feel more safe. And that if you're too focused on trying to decipher evidence from them, you're maybe not going to serve them well enough as a, warm arm to cry on, in a way.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I think that's probably where we have to remember what our role is. So we have people, I certainly have dealt with people who have, said to me, well, I just want them to leave me alone. I just want them to go away. I just want them. And you have to have an honest conversation that actually supporting that investigation and going through that process is the best way to achieve what they want. And actually we do an awful lot. We do everything we can to help, but our powers are limited. Ultimately, as a police officer, you're looking at, can I or can't I prosecute? And we have safeguarding measures that we put into place. We have equipment that we can provide to victims of domestic abuse to make their houses safer. We can look at orders and things like that. We can signpost people to other agencies for civil orders and potentially help with housing or refuge. But at the end of the day, my powers as a police officer are limited to what can I do within the criminal law to help that person. And sometimes it's a very difficult conversation to say to somebody, well, if you're not going to help me, if you're not going to provide evidence, you are limiting what I can do to achieve what you want. And that's probably where, certainly for children and vulnerable adults, social workers come into play. For domestic abuse victims, it's probably more charities and other agencies, and wherever we can, we will help to help that person find the right agency for them for the outcome that they want. And if somebody doesn't want to support an investigation, they don't want to go to court, we'll always respect that, and we will always try and do everything we can without them. But in a lot of cases, that makes it very difficult to prosecute. And ultimately, we have to be honest with people about what our powers are and what we can do for them.
I guess, I definitely do as well, but in a lot of ways, I guess a lot of people see the police as kind of this all-encompassing safety net that can just fix everything, where as an actual fact, it's not. Obviously you do a hell of a lot, but it's not like you can, you're not a therapist, you're not a social worker, you're not everything all in one in terms of what the police actually is. So I guess, being able to sort of, tell people in a compassionate way that you can't fix everything for them, and that there are other things that they have to do, and maybe they have to go to, like, say, charities and other agencies.
Yeah, at times it feels like you're a police officer and a therapist and a social worker all rolled into one. It definitely does. But that's exactly it. We're not all of those things. And yes, we have lots of resources available to us to try and, you know, help guide people into the right place. But at the end of the day, we can't do everything. And I think every police officer in the country has a list of cases in their head where they think, God, I wish I could have done more. I wish I could have had conditions in place for longer. I wish I could have, you know, prosecuted that person. But at the end of the day, we are looking for cases, you know, we can only take cases to court. The CPS will only take a case to court if they think there's a more than likely chance that they'll be found guilty. And then when they're in court, they have to prove that they've done it beyond reasonable doubt. And when you're dealing with these cases, there's a lot in the news about sexual offences and rape prosecutions and things like that at the moment. And ultimately, the vast majority of what I do is two people in a room. And it's one word against another. And that makes it very, very difficult to then prove beyond reasonable doubt that one of those people is telling the truth over the other one.
Especially something that happens in such a private atmosphere, especially a one-time thing, like after a night out, drunken, you know, those sorts of scenarios. It's impossible to tell what's exactly happened or what's gone wrong.
Yeah, exactly. It's, you know, it's a very private offence. It's something that there's only two people that know exactly what has happened, and it's very, very difficult to then prove exactly what went on.
And how often are you sat there and you're just, I suppose you've got to be so even when you think about this, but how often are you sat there and you're just thinking, I know you're lying, but I can't prove that you're lying?
So police have a duty to investigate, to prove or disprove, to obtain evidence that points towards or away from a suspect. So I've had moments where I've sat there and felt like the suspect was lying to me. I've had times where I've sat there and felt that a victim was lying to me. It goes both ways. Ultimately, I think it comes down to, you know, it doesn't really matter what you kind of think, excuse me, someone in my car park. It doesn't really matter what I necessarily think. And I think that's what we have to remember. It's what are we going to present in court, and what can we and can't we prove? And that's why we look for anything that will strengthen either account. So, you know, going through people's mobile phones, going to people's friends, what they've told people, people's histories, that is to look for whose account at the end of the day is going to be stronger. And can we show one way or the other that one person is telling the truth?
Are you in the room with the one-way glass or the two-way windows?
There's no two-way windows.
Oh, okay. But you're in that sort of, you put them in the cold room with the desk.
Yeah, I mean, often they are swelteringly hot rooms, I'm not going to lie. But we pardon?
Coldly decorated.
Yes. So custody certainly, could do with a bit of interior design. So we go to interview rooms, very bland interview rooms, and we interview either on disc or on like audio only or on video to interview suspects. Yeah.
And are you good cop or are you bad cop? Is that a real thing?
Not really. I hate to burst your bubble, but it's not really. I think that a good interviewer can probably alter their own manner to gain the best evidence. So sometimes there's people that you don't really want to be nice to, but you might be nice to them because that's going to get you a better result. But at the end of the day, we just the majority of interviews are obtaining that person's account, and so you're kind of polite and professional to everybody.
How often do you get cases where there just isn't any evidence? Because I'm just thinking about, like we said before, it can be so difficult for a victim to come to the police. And what if, I'm sure this has happened, where they come to the police for a situation that they've been involved in, and then nothing can happen because there's no evidence, but in their head that, this has actually happened. I'm sure that can be very damaging for that victim who has finally plucked up the courage to come to the police.
I mean, certainly in my department, there's a lot of cases where there's very little evidence. I mean, their account is evidence, so there's always something. The suspect's account, if they choose to provide one, is evidence. But evidence that is kind of objective and, kind of cold hard evidence, if you like, evidence that is independent, there are plenty of cases where there isn't any at all. And there's certainly, we will do everything we can. We will talk to anyone that they've talked to, see if they want to make statements to us. We look at, as I said, digital evidence, things like that. But there are plenty of cases where there is ultimately no evidence.
And that conversation is going to be pretty hard to tell them that, can't go in.